Tonight at 10, the Prime Minister insists she intends to fight the next general election. Theresa May said there was no truth whatsoever to report she would stand down in 2 years' time.
I'm here for the long term, and it's crucial. What me and my government are about is not just delivering on Brexit, we are delivering a brighter future for the United Kingdom.
The Prime Minister was speaking in Japan, where she's hoping to discuss a post-Brexit trade deal, also tonight. After North Korea's latest missile test, President Trump says talking is not the answer to the crisis. The worst is yet to come, warns the governor of Texas, as Tropical Storm Harvey sweeps into neighbouring Louisiana. The brother of the Manchester bomber is to go on trial in Libya in connection with the attack which left 22 people dead. And on the eve of the 20th anniversary of Princess Diana's death, William and Harry visit a memorial garden for their mother at Kensington Palace.
And coming up in Sports Day on BBC News, Liverpool have agreed a £40 million deal to sign the England midfielder Alex Oxlade-Chamberlain from Arsenal.
Good evening. Theresa May has insisted that she intends to stay on to fight the next general election. The Prime Minister, who is visiting Japan, told the BBC that there was absolutely no basis whatsoever to reports that she would stand down in 2 years' time. She said she was here for the long term. She was speaking to the BBC at the start of a 3-day visit to Japan, during which she's hoping to ease concerns about Brexit and prepare the way for a trade agreement. From there, our political correspondent Ben Wright reports his report contains some flash photography.
It's Theresa May's first visit to Japan as Prime Minister. She doesn't plan on it being her last. Wearing the colours of the country's flag, this visit is a reminder that Brexit is not just about fractious talks in Brussels, it's about reassuring long-standing allies and investors beyond the EU. Stick with us, her message to Japan. But Theresa May also revealed her ambition here and had a message for her critics back home. Is it your intention to lead the Tory party into the next general election?
Yes, I'm here for the long term, and it's crucial. What me and my government are about is not just delivering on Brexit, we are delivering a brighter future for the United Kingdom.
It's the first time Theresa May has been so blunt about her plans to fight the next election in 2022, and her Foreign Secretary today seemed enthused at the prospect.
I'm giving my undivided backing to Theresa May. We need to get Brexit done. She's ideally placed to deliver a great outcome for our country, get a great negotiation.
By the next general election, Britain will be out of the EU. The question is on what terms, and Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe wants to know much more about the UK government strategy. Over 3 decades, more than 1,000 Japanese firms have established a presence in Britain, employing 140,000 people between them. Not just the big 3 car makers, but manufacturers and banks too. Both ways, it's a trade relationship that matters. But some of Japan's banks, for instance, are worried their access to EU markets could suffer if Brexit backfires.
Some financial institutions have announced that they prepare moving a certain number of operations and jobs from London to the European continent to obtain the single passport within the EU. This is not good for the UK.
Do you still think that no deal is better than a bad deal? We could still walk away.
Yes, I think that is right. But if you talk about the point at which we leave the European Union, we want to ensure that at that point we do have a deal, and that we have a deal that is the right deal for the United Kingdom.
After about 8 hours in Kyoto, Theresa May is now moving on to Tokyo for the rest of this 3-day trip, where of course discussions about trade will dominate the talks. But she has come here and tried to settle for good this question around her leadership that's dogged her since the botched general election in June. The question is whether her MPs and her party, thousands of miles away back in the UK, accept that she can stick this out for the long term. Ben Wright, BBC News in Kyoto.
Well, our political correspondent Eleanor Garnier is in Westminster. So what will the reaction here be then?
Well, it's a marked contrast to the Theresa May of 2.5 months ago. Remember, back then, red-faced after that disastrous election result, she was apologising to Tory MPs, telling them she'd stay on as long as they wanted her to. Fast forward, now she says she's in it for the long term and does want to take the party into the next general election. In the short term, there is zero appetite among Conservative MPs for a leadership contest. They fear it could trigger a general election. So in that sense, these comments won't unsettle the party and they may be a relief to some. But in the long term, few see Theresa May taking the party into the next general election. Many say it's not if she goes, but when. And tonight, some have told me that by revealing her ambition to stay on until 2022, she's put herself in direct conflict with the party. Now, with Brexit negotiations going on, she won't want this distraction of leadership talk. But the truth of it is, if backbenchers decide her time is up, there'll be little she can do about it.
Eleanor in Westminster, thank you. And let's go now to those Brexit talks, which are meant to wrap up tomorrow in Brussels. Damian Grammaticus is there, and there have been some major sticking points to deal with.
Sophie, yes, there are some real difficulties we see with these talks, and they boil down to a fundamental difference of opinion about how the talks work and really who's in charge. Now, the UK side, we know in there, feel deeply frustrated that the EU will not move on to trade talks yet, and in some areas feel that the EU won't engage in the give and take of normal negotiations. Today, on the EU side, the chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, he said he's happy to be flexible, but the UK has to put its positions down on the table and be clear. Now, there were all those papers the UK produced. The EU says many lack detail, and on money, the crucial issue, there isn't one. That's a deliberate strategy from David Davis and Theresa May. Hold back on money to try to force the pace onto trade talks. But it's risky because it's not the UK that controls this. The other EU 27 countries would have to agree to any change, and the more time that is spent arguing about the structure of things, the less time there is to negotiate that bespoke deal that the Prime Minister wants.
Damian Grammaticus in Brussels, thank you. President Trump says that talking is not the answer to the North Korea missile crisis. It comes after Pyongyang said yesterday's missile test over Japan was the first step of military operations in the Pacific. But later, the American Defense Secretary, James Mattis, insisted there is still room for diplomacy in dealing with North Korea and its missile threat. From Tokyo, Rupert Wingfield-Hayes reports.
These are the first pictures of North Korea's latest and most provocative missile launch. As expected, Kim Jong-un was on hand to give his personal guidance. The North Korean dictator gazes skywards as the missile flies towards Japan. And along with the pictures came this statement from North Korea's state media. The current ballistic rocket drill is the first step of the military operation in the Pacific and a meaningful prelude to containing Guam. North Korea's statement shows the ultimate target of yesterday's test was not here in Japan, but the US Pacific island of Guam, with its huge military bases, and that North Korea intends more such tests. So what can be done to stop it? Last night in New York, the UN Security Council members, including China, were unanimous in condemning North Korea. But today, the cracks have already begun to appear. From President Trump came this tweet, ruling out any prospect of talks. The US has been talking to North Korea and paying them extortion money for 25 years, he exclaimed. Talking is not the answer. Here in Japan, Prime Minister Theresa May said China must now do something.
But we want to work with international partners to see what further pressure can be brought on North Korea, and of course particularly look at what China can do.
In Beijing, China's Foreign Ministry spokeswoman had this rather caustic response.
Some countries dash forward when it comes to imposing sanctions, but hide away when it comes to asking for peace talks. This is not the attitude of a responsible nation.
There is growing suspicion that North Korea could not have developed this new missile so fast by itself. There is also agreement that it must be stopped, but there is none on how to do it. China wants talks, the US, Britain and Japan more sanctions. Meanwhile, North Korea is almost certainly preparing for its next test. Rupert Wingfield-Hayes, BBC News, in Tokyo.
The governor of Texas says the worst is not yet over for some parts of the state as torrential rain continues to fall in the wake of Tropical Storm Harvey. The flooding has forced a number of oil and gas pipelines and refineries to shut down, affecting almost a quarter of America's fuel output. At least 20 people are known to have died. The storm has now moved on to neighbouring Louisiana. When Harvey hit landfall on Friday, it was already a powerful Category 4 hurricane, which was expected to cause flooding. But high pressure was already sitting over America, and that is what made a bad storm an awful lot worse. Instead of moving inland and weakening as expected, Harvey became trapped over Texas for several days. And that meant that the tropical storm was able to suck up more and more warm ocean water from the Gulf of Mexico and then dump it in record levels on Houston. From there, James Cook reports.
This is what Hurricane Harvey did to Houston. Believe it or not, the water has gone down, and still swathes of the city look like this. Lives have been lost, homes have been ruined, and people are still trapped. From the air, we spotted this couple, desperate for help. Well, what's happening now is that we've seen these people in the water down below. They're clearly in need of help. There's a boat just a few blocks away, but it can't get to them, it can't see them. So we're going to use the helicopter to try to guide them in. Slowly, carefully, we help them find one another. A helicopter directing a boat along a leafy street, suburban America turned upside down. They made it. Just seconds later, we spotted this, fire and flood, and no way in for the firefighters. This was a 5-minute slice of the drama which has been unfolding in the skies over Houston for days. And not just Houston. This is Port Arthur in neighbouring Louisiana, where Harvey has hit again. The hurricane may have been downgraded to a tropical storm, but it still packs a powerful punch. With 40 inches of rain here, they're taking what they can as they help their children escape. Back in downtown Houston, still dazed, but at least they're dry. The people of the city do now have a chance to take stock, and they know there are struggles ahead.
There's an extra room for... Thank you, guys.
Rodman Young is now homeless in his own city after his house was flooded when 2 reservoirs spilled over.
It's sad. It is sad, and you feel a little bit hopeless because you're losing all your stuff, and they only gave us from the point we woke up, a couple hours to leave. And we were fighting the waters at our house.
And here, people formed a chain to help an elderly man who was trapped in his car. The human touch that has brought people together, plain to see. As it moves across the southern United States, the wake of this storm is widening, and so is the damage. The bleak legacy of Hurricane Harvey will be felt for years to come. James Cook, BBC News, Houston.
Well, thousands are in need of assistance. Our correspondent Neda Tawfik is at an emergency shelter in Houston. So many people have been left homeless by this and no sign of an end to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I spoke with the mayor earlier he said now that Houston is drying up, absolutely one of their priorities will be to rehouse the thousands of people that are here. Inside, the city has tried as best as they could to anticipate people's needs. Of course, they've handed out hot meals, there's toiletries. Even a psychiatrist is on hand to help people deal with the trauma. But still, there is no end in sight. And one of the things that people are the most concerned about, of course, is how to rebuild their homes with no flood insurance. And so federal aid is going to be absolutely key. One single mother here with her 4 children told me that without this shelter, she would be out on the street and she might even have to go to another shelter after this. But still, they are very, very lucky, they know, to have their lives still. As the waters have receded, we've seen the death toll rise. In fact, the county officer has said that he's terrified to see how much more the body count will go up.
Neda, thank you. Britain is halving the amount of money it gives in humanitarian aid to Nigeria from next year, saying the country must do more to defeat Boko Haram extremists. Speaking on a visit to the affected areas, the International Development Secretary, Priti Patel, said other countries needed to share the burden of funding and providing humanitarian and other assistance. James Robbins reports from Nigeria.
British soldiers are not themselves fighting the Islamist extremists of Boko Haram, but members of the Royal Anglian Regiment are training Nigerian forces to be far more effective against them. The Nigerian army has had some successes retaking territory in the northeast, but the government is widely blamed for claiming some sort of victory when violence still rages. In the city of Maiduguri, these are some of the victims of Boko Haram being cared for by the International Red Cross. We were asked not to use her name, but this woman was badly injured. One of her children was killed. 2 suicide bombers, she told me, both teenage girls, blew themselves up close to our home. Listening to the stories, many of them harrowing stories from these patients, underscores one of the grimmest features of this conflict, the increasing reliance of Boko Haram on children as suicide bombers. Estimates vary, but the United Nations believes that at least 80 children have been used as suicide bombers in this region this year alone. Starvation is one consequence as people flee their homes and farms. Over 400,000 children have severe acute malnutrition. Britain is helping about a quarter of them. Today, Boris Johnson and Priti Patel met one recovering child, but the Development Secretary says Britain must reduce its humanitarian aid next year. Others should do more.
My job isn't just to give aid and to give money. My job is to make sure that that aid goes further and that we leverage that with the Nigerian government to get them to step up and do more.
Nigerian soldiers relax at the end of another arduous day of British training, but their country has nothing to celebrate. The war against Boko Haram is very far from over. James Robbins, BBC News, Nigeria.
Scottish Labour is about to get its 4th leader in 4 years after Kezia Dugdale resigned with immediate effect. Ms Dugdale said the party had been revitalised during her 2 years in charge and that it was time for a new leader with fresh energy, drive and a new mandate. She's been speaking to BBC Scotland's political editor, Brian Taylor.
Kezia Dugdale. Yet more fake news.
No, this is for real. Scottish Labour has lost another leader. Kezia Dugdale can be ferocious with opponents.
I've done the hard lifting. I was told I had the toughest job in Scottish politics. I'd like to think I've made it a bit easier for the next person.
Now is not the time to retreat.
But she also has form for criticising Jeremy Corbyn. In June last year, highlighting opposition from Labour MPs.
If I had just lost 80% of my parliamentary colleagues, I simply could not do my job. And I think it's now extremely difficult for Jeremy Corbyn to continue.
Times change. Kezia Dugdale now backs Mr Corbyn, loyally supporting his Scottish tour last week. Still, the left never quite forgave her, arguing that Scottish Labour needed to embrace the full Corbyn programme. But she told me she was definitely not bowing to pressure.
I refute that completely. What I'm trying to do is something that politicians rarely do, which is to leave with my head held high without any sort of crisis.
Are you going before you were pushed?
Absolutely not.
Reasons for going? She faced an intense spell as leader through successive elections. She takes credit for helping rescue Scottish Labour from oblivion, plus personal factors, the breakup of a long-standing relationship, the death of her closest friend. Rivals praised her efforts.
We're opponents, but I've always admired the guts and the determination that she's brought to that task in the most difficult of times.
Kezia Dugdale's deputy Alex Rowley will act as interim leader, but won't seek the top job. Neil Findlay, Jeremy Corbyn's #1 fan in Scotland, has ruled himself out. The left might favour Richard Leonard, an MSP with a strong trade union grounding. Many also point to Anna Sarwar, who's performed well in the health remit at Holyrood.
So was there an orchestrated coup to oust Kezia Dugdale? No. But was there continuing disquiet among parts of the left about her leadership? Yes, there was, and that was a factor in her decision to stand down. Scottish Labour will now hold a leadership contest. They're good at them. They've had plenty of practice in recent years. Brian Taylor, BBC News, Edinburgh.
The brother of the Manchester bomber will go on trial in Libya in the next 2 months in connection with the attack in May, which left 22 people dead. Hashim Abedi was arrested in Libya shortly after the suicide attack carried out by his brother Salman. But in an exclusive interview with the BBC's Orla Guerin, the prosecutor in the case said their father has been released.
This is Hashim Abedi, just after he was taken into custody by a counter-terrorism unit in Tripoli. The BBC has learned that he has been directly questioned here several times by British police. Libya's chief investigator told us the authorities here believe he played a key role in the attack.
All the signs point to Hashem being directly involved, assisting his brother, and collecting the materials for the suicide bombing which took a lot of innocent lives in Manchester.
Do you expect to see Hashim Abedi on trial here this year?
Of course, all the investigations will be completed in 2 months at most. Anything needed from the General Prosecutor or the police will be ready for the court.
The authorities here have detained another relative of the Abedi brothers, Mohammed Yunus Abedi, in connection with the attack. They say his credit card was used to buy ingredients for the bomb, and they have given British police a list of others in the UK who should be questioned.
These people should be questioned to get more information about the suspects, their movements, their ideologies, if there were any sign that they were going to carry out the attack. They are not necessarily suspects themselves, but it's important to get information from them.
But Libyan investigators have now finished with Ramadan Abedi, the father of Hashim and Salman. We went to his home on the outskirts of Tripoli. He's already back here with his family, but we were told he was tired and did not want to comment. Well, we have tried to speak to Ramadan Abedi, but he's been unwilling to see us. The authorities have told us they have no reason to hold him any longer in this case. He is now a free man, but not free to leave the country. They want him to remain in Libya in case they have any further questions, and he'll have to check in with police from time to time. A relative told us Ramadan Abedi was shocked at what his son Salman had done. No father wants his child to be a suicide bomber, he said. He told us the family was now happy at the release of an innocent man. Orla Guerin, BBC News, Tripoli.
The boss of the oil giant Shell, the biggest company in Britain, has questioned whether the government's plan for greater transparency in executive pay will work. Ministers want companies to force the UK's biggest firms to reveal how much more their chief executives are paid compared to the average worker. But Shell's Ben van Beurden, who earned £7.5 million last year, argues that the government's proposal is flawed. Our business editor Simon Jack reports from Rotterdam.
Big business. How do you stop too much money flowing to the top? The government has a plan, but does it make sense?
This is Shell's Rotterdam refinery. It has customers and employees all over the world. It's the most valuable company on the London Stock Exchange and pays more dividends to UK pension funds than any other company. How do you get a grip on a company like that?
That's the old refinery, but also a lot of the new
Ben van Beurden is Shell's chief executive. The UK government's flagship proposal to curb pay is to force companies to publish how many times more the boss gets paid than the average worker. Simple?
It's a matter of public record. You were paid £7.5 million last year. That was a 60% increase from the previous year. And could you tell me what the multiple is of your pay versus the average Shell employee? Do you know that number?
Well, no, I don't have that number to hand, because and not because I wouldn't care about it or I would forget about it or whatever. It's who is the average Shell worker? The average one in the UK, the average one in the United States, or globally, or do we include the people who work on our forecourts or not, etc. So this is going to be a very complicated definition piece.
The government's clear it should be average UK pay, an incentive to push up pay here. But does it make sense for a company that operates in over 70 countries?
It sounds to me that the natural conclusion from what you've said is that your position with government saying, look, measures like this don't work for companies like ours.
Sometimes it comes down to that. Sometimes we say, well, why don't you do this? Or why don't you look at this particular way of metric or strengthening, etc. So conversation doesn't mean pushback, pushback, pushback. It means finding constructive ways forward.
Shell is not alone, of course. The Premier League of UK business is stuffed full of multinationals who will also feel this government attempt to put a lid on pay just doesn't fit. Simon Jack, BBC News.
The Himba, famous for the red ochre in their hair and skin, are one of the world's endangered cultures. For centuries, they pursued a semi-nomadic life, living off the land in a remote part of northern Namibia. Having survived mass killings by German troops in the early 1900s, they've managed to retain their traditional lifestyles. But they now face a bigger threat: encroaching modernisation. Pumza Filani has travelled to a Himba village for the second of our series on changing Africa.
The start of a busy morning for the women of this Himba village as they begin their daily duties. This indigenous community has lived off the land for generations, closed off from modern society. But since Namibia's independence in the early 90s, a different lifestyle has begun to filter through.
They prepare the hares after 3 months when they see that the hair is getting old.
Owen Kataparo is a Himba man who grew up in the village. He's taken me back to Umuhoro to show me how his community is changing.
When these children get into the school, most of the children, they feel shame and they think other children, they are talking about them, that they are not looking so beautiful. And I've been also asking some of the Himba children, why you don't dress the same, your own traditional? They say, no, we don't look nice.
The irony that he's in Western clothing is not lost on him. Now running his own business, Owen feels he needs to assimilate to fit in. He's a sign of success, a poster boy of what's possible.
A lot of boys, they leave the village and go down into the town to try to find a job. And some of the boys, they find jobs, and some of the boys, they don't find jobs. Some of them, they decide to take alcohol. They end up abusing their life.
For those taking the leap, the closest town is Opuwo, an hour's drive away and the capital of this region. But this integration comes at a cost. The Himba are often the subject of ridicule. A spectacle to pick and prod. We are told this type of behavior is a common occurrence. But it doesn't concern Chief Nongaba. As the head of the village, you'd expect him to be fighting to hold on to the past, but instead he's preparing his children for a life outside of the village walls by sending them to school.
Yes, I don't want them to
Why is that? But one of the chief's wives is worried that her people are simply not ready for that life. Still, some want a taste of this new world. One of the most popular places for the Himba is this bar. Here, they come to shed the responsibility of traditional living. In this world, it's everyone for themselves. Caught between the allure of modern life and a desire to save his traditional culture, people like Owen are left straddling both worlds.
It scares me a lot. I prefer to die before the tradition of my people finish. I have seen quite enough for the 15, 20 previous years when it changed step by step. But today I'm sure it is on the edge to fall.
A clash of two worlds, a culture at a crossroads, a people unprepared for an uncertain future. Pumza Filani, BBC News, Opuwo, Namibia.
Tomorrow will mark the 20th anniversary of the death of Princess Diana in Paris. Today, her sons William and Harry visited a memorial garden that's been created at Kensington Palace in memory of their mother. The White Garden is dedicated to Princess Diana's life and work. Our royal correspondent Nicholas Witchell reports.
The flowers and the tributes are back at the gates of Kensington Palace, a very small echo of how it was 20 years ago, but a reminder of feelings which the years have not erased. And this afternoon, William and Harry came to view the tributes. They took their time, they looked, and they read. And they laughed at some of the photographs showing them as small children with their mother. It was impossible not to be reminded of how it was 20 years ago when, aged 15 and 12, on their return to London, they'd come out, still numb and bewildered, to meet the people who'd gathered there and to see for themselves the many thousands of bouquets which had been left. Diana's boys are both in their 30s now. William settled and about to begin full-time royal duty. He was accompanied by Catherine this afternoon to view a memorial garden to Diana. And Harry, not quite so settled yet, but not far off, one suspects, and both at this anniversary, one must assume, reassured by the enduring regard people feel for their mother.
She gave us so much. We were so privileged to have her.
She meant so much to so many people. She touched everybody, and it shows by how many people are here today.
William and Harry took some of the flowers people had brought and placed them at the palace gates, replaying some of the moments from 2 decades ago and acknowledging the desire that many still have to hold on to Diana's memory.
Today, briefly, they've put on their public, princely faces to view some of the tributes. Tomorrow, though, William and Harry will remain in private, remembering the mother they lost in such tragic circumstances 20 years ago. Nicholas Witchell, BBC News, at Kensington Palace.
That is almost it from us, but this is what's coming up on Newsnight on BBC Two with Evan Davis.
Tonight, a case of a white Christian 5-year-old girl put into the foster care of Muslim families has made headlines in recent days. These cases can be complex, but is something wrong in the world of fostering? Does culture or religious background even matter? Join me now on BBC Two.
Meanwhile, here on BBC One, it is time for the news where you are. Good night.